She thought it was just a $1 gamble, a dusty old storage unit, forgotten on the edge of town. But behind the rusted metal door and beneath a wrinkled tarp was more than just chrome and leather. What she uncovered was the final chapter of someone else's dream. A dream left unfinished, waiting for the right hands to bring it back to life. What began as a blind bid turned into a legacy she never expected to inherit. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, stories about second chances, hidden histories, and heart-driven restoration, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The wind was dry and sharp that morning, tugging at the loose strands of her ponytail as she stood outside Unit 182 of Glenfield Self-Storage. The metal door loomed in front of her, streaked with rust and sun-bleached paint. Her boots crunched over cracked asphalt, and in her hand, a slip of paper with just 3 words: paid, $1. Jessa Morrow wasn't a gambler by nature, but she'd been to enough estate auctions and forgotten locker sales to know, once in a while, a broken thing holds a story. And stories, not parts, were what she lived for. As a mechanic raised on her grandfather's knuckle-busted lessons, she'd learned to listen to machines like they were people. The unit had called to her in a strange way. It wasn't the size, it wasn't the number. It was the silence behind that door, like something inside was still waiting. The auctioneer had smirked when her lone bid went through. Could be trash, he'd said, not unkindly. Could be treasure. She just nodded. For $1, she figured even rusted scrap would be worth the salvage. Now, with a deep breath, she reached for the latch. The lock came off with a clink, and she gripped the handle, bracing her weight against the corrugated steel. It groaned upward, inch by inch, until daylight slipped in and lit the shadows. First, she saw dust, thick and undisturbed. Then, chrome. A wide bumper gleamed through the gloom like a smile half-remembered. Behind it, a shape hulking under a tan canvas tarp, perfectly fitted but drooping from time's heavy hand. Her breath caught in her throat. Whatever was under there had been cared for once. This wasn't a pile of old junk. This had been loved. She stepped forward, the scent of aged oil and sun-warmed dust hitting her like a memory. Her gloves brushed the canvas. She paused. "I hope you're not just beautiful," she murmured to the silence. "I hope you've got a story." With one swift pull, she peeled the cover back. The front grille caught the light first wide, gleaming, unmistakably classic. A 1,940 seconds Packard, by the looks of it. The kind of car built when craftsmanship meant something. Her heart skipped. The paint, though faded, still held its deep navy hue. The tires were low, but intact. The glass unbroken. She walked slowly around the body, hand trailing lightly over curves shaped by another era. No plates, no papers. But in the back seat, something else. A small wooden crate. Locked. She stared at it for a long moment, the warm air buzzing with the sound of distant cicadas. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she sat on the low curb just outside the unit, the Packard resting quietly behind her, like it was catching its breath after years in the dark. That $1 hadn't bought her scrap. It had bought her a mystery. And Jessa Morrow, mechanic and maybe something more, was ready to find out why. The next morning, Jessa returned to the unit before the sun had even cleared the rooftops. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept circling back to the Packard, playing the same reel, over and over again, the shape of it under the tarp, the way the chrome glinted, the silence it held like a secret. She hadn't told anyone yet. Not because she wanted to keep it to herself, but because something about it felt sacred. Like saying it out loud would break the spell. She rolled the door up again. It rattled on its track, and cool morning air spilled into the narrow space. The Packard sat just as she'd left it, quiet, patient, almost regal. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight like snow. She stepped inside, boot heels tapping on the concrete, and ran her hand along the fender again, this time slower. The paint was faded but solid. No major dents, no vandalism. The tires had settled from age, but still held their shape. This car hadn't been abandoned. It had been preserved. Jessa reached for the driver's side door handle, half expecting it to resist, but it opened with a low creak. The interior was worn but stunning bench seats wrapped in cracked leather, dashboard dials rimmed in tarnished brass. Every switch, every knob, still intact. She ran her fingers over the steering wheel and closed her eyes. Somebody used to sit here. Not just once. Often. The seat cushion had that distinct impression, not collapse, but memory. Like whoever had driven it had always come back. The keys weren't in the ignition, but a small ring hung from the rear-view mirror, 3 keys, 2 small and silver, 1 brass and square. A motel key tag dangled beside them, faded numbers barely visible. She gently pulled the tag free and squinted at it. Room 6, Redwood Pines Inn. She'd never heard of it, but it felt important. Her attention turned to the crate in the back seat. Small, wooden, locked with a simple latch and brass padlock. She reached into her tool bag and pulled out a small pick set not for mischief, but for old ignition repairs and glove compartments that refused to give up their secrets. A couple of nudges, a click. The lock gave. She lifted the lid and held her breath. Inside was a folded cloth. At first glance, it seemed like just that linen, yellowed at the edges, old. But as she unfolded it, something dropped into her palm. A photograph. It was black and white. A man, maybe in his 40s, standing in front of the very same Packard. His hand rested on the hood. He wore a military uniform, army, by the insignia. The smile on his face was soft, proud. Behind him, a small boy stood barefoot, clutching a wrench, grinning. Jessa's throat tightened. This car wasn't just classic. It was someone's history, and she was now part of its future. The photograph haunted her. Jessa had slipped it into a plastic sleeve and pinned it to the corkboard above her workbench, just beside the photo of her and her grandfather on the day they rebuilt their first carburetor. She'd been 12 in that picture. Grease on her nose, grinning, holding a wrench too big for her hands. Now, 29 and running her own garage, she stared at the new photo. The boy in it, maybe 8 or 9, barefoot beside the Packard, and felt something stir, something deep. This wasn't just some junkyard find. Someone had loved that car the way she had loved her first build. That mattered. By late afternoon, she'd towed the Packard to her shop, not an easy task, given its weight and her flatbed's stubborn hydraulics. But it made it. Nestled into Bay 2, the car looked less like a relic and more like a sleeping animal waiting to wake. As always, she began with the glove box. She tugged the handle. It didn't budge. A quick pry with a flathead screwdriver, and the latch popped free. Dust scattered as it opened. Inside, a brittle envelope. Her breath caught. It had a name written in neat cursive. Jack Stanton. No stamp. No address. Just 2 words under the name, penned in blue ink. In case someone cares. Her chest tightened. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat down on the shop stool and turned it over in her hands, careful not to tear the corners. The paper was delicate, stained with time, and something darker near the fold. It smelled like paperbacks and motor oil, oddly comforting. She unfolded it slowly. The writing was firm, slanted. Mail, maybe. Definitely deliberate. She began to read. If you're reading this, I guess someone finally opened the box. First off, thank you. I didn't want this car to vanish without anyone knowing why it mattered. The Packard belonged to my father, John Stanton Sr., who bought it with his first paycheck back from Korea. It was more than a car. It was our bond. He taught me to drive in it, taught me to fix it, taught me to keep things running even when they didn't want to. Jessa swallowed hard, eyes scanning the page like it might disappear if she blinked. I planned to restore it with my own son one day, the way Dad did with me. But life didn't go that way. Divorce, distance, then diagnosis. I was told I wouldn't see 60. I packed away the car, hoping maybe someday someone would find it who understood. So, if that's you, whoever you are, I ask one thing. Don't flip it for profit. Don't strip it for parts. If you fix her up, do it with care. Do it with someone you love, if you can. And if not, do it with heart. Jack Stanton. She stared at the signature a long time. Jessa didn't know this man, but she knew that feeling. The ache of unfinished work, and the quiet, desperate hope that someone else might finish it for you. The name echoed in her head all night, Jack Stanton. It rolled around in the quiet spaces, just behind the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of her old ceiling fan. She'd read the letter 3 times before placing it carefully in a Ziploc and tucking it into her fireproof box next to her grandfather's shop deeds and the certificate of ownership for her first motorcycle. By morning, curiosity had outpaced caution. She sat down at her desk, cracked her knuckles, and opened her laptop. A few quick searches led her to nothing. No recent obituaries, no social media hits, no town records in Glenfield. But then, she tried something different. Jack Stanton, plus Packard, plus Redwood Pines. A result popped up on page 3, an old classified ad from 2001 inches of vintage car newsletter. 1,948. Packard Super 8, not for sale. Waiting for the right time. J.S. Redwood Pines. No contact info. Just a short blurb. But it confirmed one thing. This wasn't just a car. This was the car. She reached for the motel key tag again. Room 6, Redwood Pines Inn. Her thumb traced the worn numbers. Another search. This time she found a listing shuttered since 2015. A faded TripAdvisor page. One review stood out. Tiny but quiet. Stayed for 2 months while fixing up Dad's car. J.S. There it was again. She leaned back in her chair, heart beating faster. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was a breadcrumb trail. A man trying to leave behind a trace of something he couldn't quite let go of. But it was fading, almost gone, and that didn't sit right with her. That afternoon, she visited the Glenfield Public Library, the one with the creaky door, and the same librarian who still remembered her from school. She requested archived phone books and property records from the early 2000s. And there it was. Stanton. Jack 209 watts. Elm Street occupation. Mechanic. She blinked. That was 2 streets away from where she lived now. She drove there immediately. The house stood quiet, beige siding, paint peeling at the corners. The porch sagged in the middle. The mailbox leaned like it was tired. No car in the driveway. She knocked. Waited. No answer. But an elderly neighbor watering her garden across the street shaded her eyes and called out, "Looking for Mr. Stanton?" Jessa turned. "Yes, ma'am. I think he used to live here." "Oh, he did. Long time ago. Sweet man. Always wore those grease-stained overalls. Used to bring over leftover tomatoes from his garden." The woman smiled softly. "Passed away about 6 years back. Cancer, I think. Shame, really." Jessa swallowed. "Did he have family?" "A boy, I think. Moved out west. They hadn't spoken in years from what I remember." The woman glanced toward the empty driveway. "Why you asking?" Jessa looked down at her hand, still stained from the day's work. She didn't have the words yet. Not the right ones. So she just said, "Because I think he left something behind, and I think I meant to finish it." The Packard sat like a monument in Bay 2, framed by the pale light of late afternoon and the scent of fresh coffee from the corner pot. Jessa rolled her stool beside it, notebook in hand, fingers already stained with ink and grease. She hadn't touched the engine yet, hadn't even popped the hood. Not because she was afraid of what she'd find, but because she wasn't ready. Not until she'd taken stock of everything Jack had left behind. She returned to the glove box and searched deeper. A rusted pen, a few old peppermints fused to their wrappers, and something else wedged tight between the casing and the side wall. She fished it out. It was a faded leather binder, the corners curled, the edges soft with time. The spine creaked as she opened it. Inside, clear plastic sleeves held pages of drawings, diagrams, notes. parts lists, sketches in pencil and ink. It wasn't just a folder. It was a blueprint. Jack Stanton hadn't simply wanted to restore the Packard, he'd planned to transform it. Each page was dated and labeled meticulously. Phase 1, engine rebuild. Phase 2, suspension retrofit. Phase 3, interior upgrade. His handwriting was rough but steady, full of shorthand and marginalia. Notations circled in red. Replace carb. Check fuel lines for rot. Consider electronic ignition modern, but hidden. She flipped to the last few pages and stopped. Tucked between two sheets was a photo she hadn't seen before. Jack, older now, salt and pepper stubble, standing beside the Packard in a state of disassembly. The hood was open, the headlights out. A rolling cart of tools behind him. And beside him, again, that same young boy. A little taller now, maybe 11. Holding up a socket wrench, grinning with pride. Jessa stared at the photo until her vision blurred. She could see the story unfolding in those images. Jack's legacy, passed down bolt by bolt, until something broke that couldn't be repaired. She turned back to the binder. Inside one pocket was a small USB drive, taped to a folded sticky note. On it, Jack had scribbled, "Final build files, in case someone finishes what I couldn't." Her hands trembled as she peeled it free. She didn't plug it in yet. Instead, she stood, walked over to the Packard, and finally opened the hood. It groaned a little, but lifted smoothly. Beneath it sat a sight that both surprised and humbled her. A partially rebuilt straight-to-8 engine. The block was clean. The heads had been pulled. It was clear he'd started, perhaps even gotten farther than she expected. But then, life must have caught up. It wasn't junk. It was a baton, passed across time. Jessa leaned forward, resting her palms on the frame rail, heart pounding with a familiar rhythm, not fear, not hesitation. Resolve. If this man had written down every step, then this wasn't just his restoration. It could become hers too, she whispered. "Okay, Jack, let's finish this." The first thing Jessa did was clear the space around the Packard. Tools were sorted, the floor swept clean, and the lights above Bay 2 replaced so they didn't flicker every time she moved. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. This wasn't just a side project anymore. This was a promise. She printed out Jack's blueprints from the USB and pinned them to a corkboard beside the bay. The pages fluttered slightly whenever the garage door opened, like they were breathing. She left the photograph of Jack and his son just above the main engine schematic, a reminder of what this car once meant, and what it still could. She began with the engine bay. The straight 8 block sat there, solid and silent. The heads had been removed, the pistons frozen with time. Layers of grime coated everything, but underneath, she could feel the integrity of the machine. It wasn't beyond saving. It just needed time and care. She worked in long, quiet hours, wiping each component, soaking the bolts in penetrating oil, labeling every hose and bracket. She wasn't rushing. She couldn't. Each step felt like answering a question Jack had asked years ago, and waiting to hear if she'd gotten it right. By the third day, she had the intake manifold off. The gasket crumbled in her hands like old newspaper. She set it aside and kept going. Her fingers ached, her back stiffened, but there was a fire in her that hadn't burned in years. One afternoon, she tugged out the worn carpeting and found a small metal tag bolted to the floor pan beneath the passenger seat. It read, "To Jack, you build things better than most folks ever dream." There was no signature, just the engraving. She ran her fingers over the words, heart thudding. She didn't know who gave it to him. A friend? A partner? His father? But someone had believed in him, deeply. And now, somehow, she felt the same. She added it to the board. At night, she'd sit on a milk crate in the corner of the shop, sipping bad coffee, sketching ideas in her notebook. Adjustments to Jack's plans. Minor tweaks. Nothing bold, just enough to make the build hers, too. She didn't know what Jack would have thought about that, but she hoped he'd understand. After all, he'd said, if you fix her up, do it with heart. And she was. Every drop of sweat, every scrape, every stubborn bolt that refused to turn. She gave it all the attention of a sacred task, not because she owed him, but because something in her needed to prove that forgotten things still had value, that people, like machines, could come back to life if someone was willing to see them as more than broken. And every time she looked at the Packard, she felt it. This wasn't just restoration. This was redemption. The clanging of her wrench echoed through the bay just as the bell above the shop door rang. Jessa didn't look up at first, probably a parts delivery, but when the footsteps didn't retreat, she wiped her hands and turned. A woman stood in the doorway, late 60s maybe, wiry frame, short silver hair under a worn baseball cap. She held a pink bakery box in one hand and a pair of leather gloves in the other. You Jessa? The woman asked. I am. The woman gave a small nod. Name's Myra. I taught Jack's son back when I worked at Glenfield Elementary. Word is, you've got his Packard. Jessa blinked. I do. How'd you? Small towns. Myra shrugged, stepping inside and placing the bakery box on the workbench. Some stories don't die easy. Figured you could use some donuts. And maybe another pair of hands. Jessa didn't know what to say. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't told more than a handful of people, but something had shifted. The project was no longer just hers. It had a gravity of its own. The next day, another visitor came. Luis Martinez, a retired machinist who'd lived 2 blocks over from the Stantons. He'd heard about the Packard through his nephew at the parts store. Jack used to come by my shop, he said, pulling out a box of vintage spark plugs. Said he wanted to machine a custom manifold, but never got around to it. Figured maybe I could lend a bit of knowledge. By the end of the week, the shop had become something else entirely. People came and went. Some brought tools, others brought stories. There was Eddie, a shy 16-year-old, who wanted to learn welding. There was Cheryl, whose late husband had owned a similar Packard, and who offered upholstery advice in exchange for coffee and a seat to watch. Even Father Kent came by with his sleeves rolled and an old polishing rag in his hand. No one asked for anything in return. They just showed up. And Jessa, who'd built her life on quiet independence, found herself surrounded by a crew she hadn't known she needed. They worked in shifts. Luis handled precision grinding. Eddie learned to sandblast the chrome. Myra kept things organized and told stories about Jack's son, how he was quiet, always reading, always near his dad when he visited class. There was laughter now in the corners of the shop. Music on the old radio. The occasional hum of conversation and memory. The Packard began to transform. It wasn't just cleaner, it was brighter, like it was waking up. And so was Jessa. For years she'd worked alone, solving problems, fixing what others tossed away. But now, with every pair of hands around her, she understood something deeper. Restoration wasn't about bringing a car back to life. It was about bringing people together. The day the engine turned over, the entire shop went still. It was a Saturday morning, just after 8. Sunlight poured through the bay doors, catching dust motes mid-air like floating stars. Jessa stood behind the wheel, one hand on the key, the other gripping the edge of the seat. Luis hovered near the open hood, one hand resting on the fender. Eddie watched from the passenger side, his eyes wide and hopeful. Myra leaned against the wall, holding her breath. The moment the ignition caught, the sound wasn't loud. Not at first. It sputtered, choked, and then purred. Not like a roar, like a sigh. Alive. Jessa didn't speak. She let it idle, her hand trembling on the gear lever. The rebuilt straight 8 murmured like it was remembering how to speak. Every piston, every gear, every line and bolt, cleaned, restored, tested, loved. Luis gave a hoot that made Eddie jump, and the whole shop erupted. Laughter, applause, clapping on backs. Jessa just sat there, overwhelmed, eyes shining with something deeper than pride. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. something sacred. They let it run for a while, checking temps, watching gauges. Everything held steady. The car, Jack's car, had come back. That afternoon, they opened the big doors fully and rolled the Packard into the daylight. The new paint glowed. Midnight marine, just as Jack had planned, a metallic navy that shimmered between blue and black depending on the light. Luis had wept when they'd laid the final coat. "It's like the night sky," he'd whispered, "with miles beneath it." Jessa slid behind the wheel again, this time in silence. The keys felt different now, not like a tool, but a handoff. She pressed the clutch, slid it into first, and eased the car forward. It responded like it had been waiting. The Packard rolled out onto the quiet back street, tires humming softly on the pavement. She circled the block slow at first, careful. Every corner felt like rediscovering trust, but with each turn, she let it breathe a little more. The suspension held, brakes responded. The engine, rebuilt from rust, now whispered like silk. On her second lap, Eddie rode shotgun. "This is crazy," he said. "It feels like it's floating." Jessa smiled. That's what Jack wanted. When they pulled back into the bay, the crew greeted them like heroes. But she knew the real hero wasn't her. It was Jack. And it was every hand that had touched this car with care. They didn't throw a party. No balloons or speeches. Just a few folding chairs pulled into a circle and a box of greasy takeout sandwiches. But it was perfect. As dusk settled, Jessa sat alone in the car for a moment, windows down, warm breeze drifting through. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was driving someone else's story. She felt like she'd finally stepped into her own. 3 days after the test drive, a man walked into the shop just after closing time. Jessa was sweeping near Bay 2, the Packard still gleaming under the overhead lights. The others had gone home. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace that arrives only after something difficult has been made whole again. She looked up as the door creaked open. He stood just inside the threshold, tall, mid-40s maybe, with tired eyes and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He wasn't a stranger, not exactly. His face looked familiar vaguely, as if pulled from the background of the old photos she'd been studying for weeks. "You must be Jessa," he said. "I am," she replied, straightening. He stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the Packard. His voice caught a little. "That was my dad's car." Her breath hitched. "You're Jack's son." He nodded, swallowing hard. Nathan Stanton." Jessa didn't speak right away. She studied him. Same eyes as Jack, same quiet way of standing like he was afraid to take up too much space. "I didn't know you were looking for it," she said gently. "I wasn't," he admitted. "Not at first. I didn't even know he'd left it in storage until last week. A lawyer finally tracked me down. Said someone bought a unit with a classic Packard inside. Said they'd found a letter." She nodded slowly. "I did." Nathan looked at the car again. "You brought it back." Jessa motioned him over, unlocking the door. "Want to sit in it?" He hesitated, then walked over, brushing the roof with his fingertips before sliding in behind the wheel. He let out a shaky breath as his hands closed around the steering wheel. "I haven't been in this car since I was 12, he said quietly. "He used to let me ride up front when we went for weekend drives. Said someday we'd rebuild it together." Jessa pulled a chair over and sat beside the open door. "He wanted that more than anything." "I know," Nathan said, voice breaking. "But I didn't. I was angry. When he got sick, I didn't visit. I told myself I was too busy. I missed the funeral." Silence settled between them. Jessa reached into her notebook and pulled out the photograph Jack and Nathan beside the Packard. She handed it over without a word. Nathan stared at it a long time, then held it to his chest. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "It's not about deserving," Jessa said softly. "It's about finishing what matters." He looked at her, eyes full. "Thank you, for not just selling it off, for seeing it," she smiled. He made it easy to care. Nathan sat for a long while, not speaking, just running his hand along the wheel. Then he turned the key, and the Packard purred to life again. And for the first time in decades, a father and son found a way to connect, not through words, but through what they built and left behind. Autumn rolled in soft that year. The mornings came cooler, the sun dipped earlier, and the trees lining the Glenfield backroads began to burn gold and red. Outside Jessa's garage, the Packard sat beneath a canvas canopy, polished to a deep navy shimmer, like dusk captured in steel. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was a monument. People came by just to see it, some to admire the craftsmanship, some to share memories of Jack. Others just stood quietly, hands in their pockets, eyes shining with something unspoken. It had become more than a rebuild. It was a vessel holding decades of love, loss, and redemption. Jessa didn't charge anyone to see it. She didn't need to. Business had picked up without advertising. Word had spread. People brought in their own lost things, rusted motorcycles, dusty carburetors, broken heirlooms. Not because they thought she was a miracle worker, but because they believed. If anyone could find the soul beneath the rust, it was her. She hired Eddie part-time, enrolled him in a welding course, and let him take the lead on smaller projects. Myra still came in twice a week to organize parts bins and make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Luis dropped by to help with the more delicate work, and sometimes just to sit and reminisce. As for Nathan, he came by too. Not often, but enough. One afternoon, he brought a small cedar box. Inside were photos, blueprints, and one last letter Jack had written, but never sent, addressed simply, "To my son when you're ready." Nathan hadn't opened it yet. He handed it to Jessa. "I think he'd want you to have it," he said. She shook her head. "It's yours, but I'll read it with you, if you want." So they sat in the quiet corner of the shop, the smell of metal and sawdust in the air, and opened it together. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't full of apologies. It was a roadmap of love, Jack, recounting memories, telling stories Nathan had long forgotten, sharing how much the time they spent in that car had meant. He wrote about fear, failure, hope, and how hard it is for fathers to say the right things in the right way. But he ended with this: "If you're reading this, I'm proud of you. Whether we rebuilt the car or not, the fact that you're holding this means you came back. That's enough for me." Nathan folded the letter carefully and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally did, it was just one word: "Thanks." A week later, Jessa installed a small brass plaque next to the Packard's front bumper. It read, "Jack Stanton's dream restored by many, remembered by all." And every time someone asked her how it all started, she told them the truth. "It cost me $1, but it gave me everything."